Hey guys, so I am back and I am finally going to share my testimony. This is something that I've been wanting to do for a while, and I've been praying and asking God to show me when, and so I can do it properly and share what needs to be shared. And so my story and who God has been and what God has done in my life can resonate with someone, and can really just be a testimony of who God is and what He can do, especially for those of us that have grown up in church, those that are in ministry, that are involved in church. And sometimes we might think that we don't have a testimony. We might think that we don't have anything that we can share with people. But sometimes the fact that we are standing and that we are serving God is a testimony to itself because of the times that we do live in. But I wanted to share a side of me that a lot of people don't know. So if you don't know me and someone has shared this or just randomly found me, or just in general, just a reminder of who I am. My name is Alan. I was born in Mexico. I was born in Ciudad Juarez, Chihuahua. But I was born into a family that is full of love, laughter. Even though we had our fair share of trials, we were always taught to laugh and trust in God. But, my story really begins even before I was born. My mom tells me that she had a real hard time with her pregnancy with me, and she almost lost me a couple of times. She was put on bed rest for a while. She tells me that she would constantly bleed, and they would have to rush her to the hospital just to make sure everything was fine. And I was confirming with my dad this story before I even shared it, and my dad was like, "Yeah." He's like, "I've been dealing with you and your mom since before you were born." And although he said it in a sarcastic way, it's the truth. Before I was even born, the enemy had it out for me, and it and now that I see the life that I've lived already of 32 years, I can see why. I can see why, and the enemy does that, and we do have an enemy that hates us, that is coming after us. John Eldredge says this: "The story of your life is the story of a long and brutal assault on your heart by the one who knows what it could be and fears it." In 1997, I was in first grade here in Oklahoma at Heronville Elementary. I was in first grade, and my English was still a little choppy, but it was getting a lot better. We had been in the U.S. for a little over a year now. And I was in elementary school. I was in first grade, and I remember being one of the first hits, one of the first strikes to the heart to myself, to that 6-year-old Alan, was one day we were in line for lunch. I was talking with all the kids, all the boys. We were talking about how this pizza and chocolate milk at 10:30 in the morning was gonna be like the thing. We were excited. Obviously, who doesn't like pizza, especially a 6-year-old at 10:30, 11 in the morning, right? And we start talking about the girls that we like. And I share this because the girl that in this story knows about this already, and she might watch this. And so I can share this funny story, but we start talking about who we like, right? And I say, I like Jennifer, right? I like Jennifer. And they're obviously, kids, boys especially, they're like, "Ooh, you like so-and-so." And we're in line. One of the boys takes off running, and he goes and tells Jennifer. The problem is he goes and tells the wrong Jennifer. He goes and he tells the Jennifer that didn't necessarily smell that well or dressed the nicest. We all know that kid, right? And may God bless her wherever she's at, whoever, I don't really even remember. I just know the facts of what the essential of how Jennifer looked at that time. But I was embarrassed. I was embarrassed because they started making fun of me because they started thinking that and saying that I liked weird Jennifer. I know that sounds wrong, but I mean, we were kids. They started making fun of me. And so, you know, there it was. My first wound, my first big thing, like embarrassment and shame. Although it sounds funny, it became a wound that later on the enemy had used, because then that somehow I tied it to rejection. I tied it to rejection, and so from that moment on, I kept a lot of things to myself, especially in who I liked, if I had a crush or not. I just kept those things to myself because I had already made that agreement that I would be put down, that I would be embarrassed, that I would be rejected, right? And so that was my first wound, and the enemy took advantage of that. He saw that, and he zeroed in on that, and that became a wound of me. And most wounds happens when we're a kid. We get rejected, embarrassed, abandoned. We lose a loved one. Mom and dad aren't in the picture. All these certain things come into play, and we become wounded, and when we don't address it, it gets worse. Like I mentioned before, my mom tells me of how she struggled with the pregnancy with me and how she lost me. She almost lost me. Obviously, she didn't lose me. I'm here. She almost lost me a couple of times because of just difficulties with the pregnancy. You know, growing up, my mom was very involved in church. She was one of the founders, or not founders, but she was she was in the group that revived, that's the word. She was part of the group that revived the kids ministry in our church after the kids pastor passed away. She became very involved in church, and I always say that although I'm not a PK, I'm not a preacher's kid, I'm a very involved leader's kid. And for the PKs out there, and for those that are like me, they're the leaders in the church and they were always involved, you know that a lot of times you didn't have the choice but to be at church helping. You know, they were painting the kids ministry area, you know, at the wee hours of the night, super late, because everyone worked, and that's the only time they had to work. So we would stay after prayer services on Friday and paint. And so it's, you know, 7-8-year-old me, just they hand me a brush and I'm there painting. I remember painting the hallways and helping and cleaning up, and what would probably be for like maybe 5 minutes, and then we would all get distracted and go play, because all the kids were there. We were just serving alongside with our parents. And so although I was forced to be there, I fell in love with being there. You know, and I'm still that odd kid that loves being at church. My mom would tell me, ¿Por qué no eres un niño normal? Meaning, why aren't you a normal kid? Because I was always in church. Even my nephews, now and then, they see me grab my backpack, or they see me head towards the door and grab my keys, and they'll be like, "Where are you going?" "Let me guess, church." You know, they just know that that's where I spend my time, and that's where I've grown up, and the calling that I have. So I literally grew up in church and going to church and being involved, to the point that when I aged out of kids ministry, I immediately started working. I started volunteering for Vacation Bible School and being, you know, a junior counselor at kids camp, and doing all of these things. I was so happy to be involved. So happy to be involved. And around age 16, I became, I started walking in my calling, and started working as, you know, one of, you know, a youth leader while I was still in youth ministry, I became the youth pastor at the time. I became her right hand. I was always there. And that included anything from helping teach a class to just setting up chairs for an event and staying after and cleaning up. I started walking in that calling. I just fell in love with serving God. Although I was doing all these things, I was still wounded. I was still hurt, seeking validation, seeking someone to accept me, but I didn't even notice it. Although I loved being the outcast, I didn't care if I was like the rest. But deep down inside, I really wanted to be accepted. I wanted to be known. I wanted people to understand who I was. And so what happened? I created this persona of being the funny fat kid. And I knew that I could make people laugh. And so I took that and ran with it. I kept that up, and I kept pursuing God and seeking God. And recently God has shown me and has taken me back through songs and through notes that I have found, and showing me how at a very young age I had been seeking God and had been asking God, I want to know you more. I want to give everything up for you. I want to do all of this for you. And God had been hearing my prayers. And recently those prayers are now coming to fruition. Those things that I sowed many years ago are now, I'm seeing the fruit of those things. But in that moment, there was a lot going on. There was a lot going on, and my heart was divided. I loved the Lord, but I secretly wanted to do what all the other boys were doing. And God saved me from a lot of things. And I thank God for that. I thank God for Him saving me from a lot of things. I became involved in church. I became really serious about God. But again, those wounds were there. I wanted to feel accepted. I wanted to be known because I had always felt rejected. And that led to a 16-year, almost 17-year pornography addiction. And unfortunately, I was introduced to it out of simple curiosity. No one showed me anything. No one, although I look back and I saw how the enemy had prepared me, through movies, through shows and everything. But really, the actual addiction, I was introduced to it through, I don't want to call him the youth pastor, but kind of a youth pastor, the main youth leaders when I first joined the youth. He would talk about this subject of pornography and masturbation and lust and all of these things. He would talk about it in a very casual way. He wouldn't even address it. He would just make fun of it and make fun of those that were involved in it or that would do such things. So what does a 13, 14-year-old boy do that has been in church his whole life, doesn't necessarily know what they're talking about? Curiosity killed the cat. In that moment of curiosity led into a 16-year, almost 17-year bondage to lust, to pornography, through just the perverted mindset in that area. I desired the sin that everyone had. That is such a dumb desire to have. Something that the enemy painted so sweet was so rotten and heavy that it landed me in hiding and in shame for all those years. But the hurts continue to come. The wounds became even more. I continued to follow God. I never wanted it, and I would struggle with it and ask God to take it away. And so I would continue to pursue God. In the summer of 2009, right after I graduated high school, I went to a ministry internship in San Antonio under the Assemblies of God called Impact Now. And just like anything, I came back with and absorbed what I believed was good. And I left the things that I saw that weren't good. And whether it was the way they did things or what I saw, regardless, I had a great experience and learned a lot. And I was coming back because I was excited. I was excited because I knew that the calling that God had, and that even though I was struggling with this issue of pornography and and lust and all of these things, I knew that I had a calling, and I wanted to pursue God. And I would ask God, God, just take this away from me. I want to seek you. I want to pursue you. And many times God encountered me and had to remind me of who I was. There was It was supposed to be two of us that were going to go to this internship. One of us couldn't make it. The other guy couldn't make it because of just life. He was a year out of high school already, and so things change pretty quickly once you graduate high school. So he couldn't go, and that opened the door for me to go just by myself to a place I didn't know. I didn't know anybody, and it was at this internship where God reminded me that He called me. He was calling me. He wasn't calling anybody else. I was the one that was meant to be there for a lot of reasons, and that are clearer now than they were back then. But regardless, I was ready to come back, take charge. I had already had conversations with Rachel, our youth pastor at that time, of coming back and possibly taking over, being the next youth pastor, or being, just the assistant or something. We had already talked about that there was going to be more when I came back. And now, mind you, this is not the youth pastor that introduced me. That was a male, or sparked that curiosity and did that. This was, the general youth pastor over all the other leaders. And things didn't go as planned. And that wound, that hurt, once again was pressed on. I felt rejected. I felt ignored. I came back and I was looked over for the youth pastor's part. And although I've always said, I'm not necessarily looking for a position or a title, as an 18-year-old, that hurt. As an 18-year-old that had been putting in the hours, had been working hard, had been seeking God, had gone and got the training, it hurt. It hurt to be looked over again and to be rejected once again. And the enemy used that. And he used that to pin me and this other gentleman, this other guy, against each other. And there was a lot of times where I asked God, why is this happening? I began to just do my own thing, and even then things would just crumble. I wholeheartedly believe that I would do things, in an unselfish way and not seeking anything, but it wasn't received that way. And I do see that it was that immaturity. It was that 18-year-old me, 19-year-old me. I look at 18 and 19-year-olds now and I'm like, why was I in leadership? I wasn't just an assistant. I was already teaching. I had a group of 13, 14 boys that I was teaching on a weekly basis. On top of a dance group and on top of a drama group, I was like, I had the passion, but I didn't have anybody to help me steward that passion. So I understand a lot of things now, but in that moment, the hurt was real. I mean, I was accused of manipulating young people to hang out with me. I was accused of that being witchcraft. There was a moment where the youth ministry had a meeting that I was no longer allowed to hang out with youth. And I extend grace because we were learning. We were all really young. We were all late teens and early 20s when we were leading this youth ministry, and we didn't have anybody really to show us the ropes of how it should be done. But regardless, that hurt was still there. And I recently reached out to that youth pastor, Rachel. I reached out to her and just thanking her for showing me a lot of grace at that time. We knew a lot of the struggles, and she would share a lot of things and would have to tell me no. And I understood that a lot of times she had to tell me no on ideas or suggestions because it just couldn't be done. And we sat there and we talked, and like we were really young. We were really young and we were learning a lot. And we had the passion, but it was very immature passion. And that caused a lot of hurt and a lot of pain, not just for me, but for a lot of people. And I've reached out to a lot of other people that I know that I've hurt throughout my growing up and my maturing in the Lord. And I've written letters to people that I no longer have contact with. I have written letters. I have reached out, and I've given that up to the Lord. That is in the past, and I've asked the Lord for forgiveness for my mistakes as a young person, and for the mistakes that they caused that hurt me. I have asked the Lord, and I've given them up to God and said, Lord, I forgive them. I forgive them for hurting me. I forgive them for rejecting me. I forgive them for even, and I've asked the Lord, forgive me for putting my eyes and hopes on them accepting me when I should have just been looking at you. Church hurt is real. And I know a lot of people, especially a lot of people that grew up in the church that I grew up in, a lot of people have been hurt. A lot of people have left hurt, and a lot of people have resentment and hurt, and no one wants to talk about it, but we need to talk about that church hurt is real. And I apologize for that. But I want to remind you that it wasn't God. It wasn't God, it was people. It was humans. And so I extend grace to myself and to the people around me, the leadership that I grew up in, that hurt me, that did a lot of things that caused me to put up a wall of protection, that would cause me to get stressed, and I would use that excuse to go and find pornography, and I would use that excuse to just have lustful thoughts and just escape. But that doesn't change the fact that I hurt people. I was hurt by people, but God has shown up in my life to restore and heal, and to remind me that I've also taken part of a lot of hurts and wounds to other people. And God has shown me little by little on who I need to reach out. And if you're listening to this and you're one of them, and I might not even know it, I'm sorry. So all of these years, 16 years of living a life of shame and guilt, and 16 years of not living the life that God intended for me, because I let this go untreated, and I began to feel like I was a burden. I started to feel like I was unloved, unworthy of friendship, of any sort of relationship. I had another level of guilt because I was in ministry. It was the guilt of, better. You know what Scripture says. You should not even, partake in things of the world. I had let all these hurts settle in, and I couldn't even go to my Father. I couldn't even go to God with these things, because I started to believe the lies of the enemy. I never spoke up. I never asked for prayer. I was paralyzed by guilt and shame, and accused by the enemy with every little thing that he gave me. More hurts. Friends just vanished. People I loved and cared for abandoned me. I was the afterthought. There was friends that I had friends that I no longer talk to just because of life. They just happened. And that hurt. And I felt abandoned. I felt, unloved. And this goes on for a while. God calls me out of the church that I'm at, plants me at the next church where I served for 10 years. And I saw God do great things. I say that I always wanted to go on a mission trip or be able to help and serve kids in another country and just be part of it. Not necessarily live there, but just go and, visit, have minister, be part of that mission trip, come back, right? And, being from Mexico, having only DACA, not being, being undocumented, and I couldn't go. But now serving in this church, God brings the nations to me. I was able to lead worship at the international assemblies with kids from all over the world. Um, I was able to to interpret during one of the messages in the youth conference. I have been able to make friends from people around the world, and had a chance to minister, and God had opened so many doors, and directing camps, and now leading worship, and God doing all of these awesome things. But I was still hurt, I was still wounded, and I still felt alone, I still felt ashamed. I still was looking at pornography. It was popping up no matter how much I tried, no matter how much I prayed it off. It would not leave. It was rooted down in rejection. It was rooted down in loneliness. It was rooted down in feeling unloved. And then 2019 hits. In September of 2019, my brother goes into the hospital, finds out he has leukemia, and never comes out. 2 weeks after his diagnosis, he passes away, all while my mom is being treated for ovarian cancer. 2 months later, in November, my mom passes away. All of this, I'm hurt, and I'm feeling lonely. I didn't feel like I had a friend that I could reach out to. And to the friends that did reach out and I felt numb, I apologize. But in that moment, I felt alone. But I had to be strong. I was the level-headed one in the family. I had to plan I was the one that planned the funerals, made the programs, made the calls, gathered the people. I was hurt. God brought in friends that helped me laugh again, that helped me, heal from that. And God has healed me from that wound of losing my brother and my mom. But there was still a lot that was going on. That initial wound had now settled in me and had been growing and been rotting in my heart for almost 16 years at that point. At the end of the summer of 2022, I hit my spiritual rock bottom. As I mentioned, I've been in ministry for a really long time, and so I became a professional Christian. I was good at what we call churchianity. I had a PhD in it. I knew when to clap, I knew when to laugh, I knew when to shout, I knew when to, do a little, I knew it all. Now, mind you, don't get it wrong. I meant the majority of that. I would get excited. I love the Word of God. I love learning. I love being in His presence. But I was still bound. I was still bound by this thing. I was still, feeling shame of all of this, because at that point, even normal pornography wasn't enough. Then I started looking at same sex, and then same sex attraction started popping up in my life, and I thank God that I never acted on it. He's protected me from that, but it's a real thing that a lot of times we don't like to talk about. The enemy had distorted my view of who God was, had distorted my view of sexuality, had distorted a lot of things in my life. But during this whole time, I will say that I thank God that I kept going. I kept going, and I stopped trying to pursue God, even though I know that I was wrong. And the enemy kept saying that to me. You're wrong. Look what you're doing. You're pursuing God. You're leading worship. But what you do last night, you're teaching a class. But what were you looking at yesterday? It just became deeper and deeper. And in the summer of 2022, I hit a spiritual rock bottom where I encountered a situation that was straight from hell. God really showed me in that moment that the enemy was coming after me, and he was not going to stop until he saw that I was spiritually dead and hopefully physically dead. I thank God, because in that moment of all of this spiraling and happening, and just like the analogy and just how the lion comes in and before the sun rises in the dark, tries to creep in and be sneaky about it. This is what's happening. In the middle of the night, I'm encountering this thing, and I can hear the voice of God very distant saying, be careful. This is it. That next morning, just a spirit of perversion was over me. I couldn't stop thinking lustful thoughts. I couldn't do anything. And I said, enough. I said, I'm done. I'm done with this. I called up my friend and I said, hey, I need to talk to you like now. I need to expose this. And I called a pastor friend of mine and my pastor, and we talked about it. We prayed about this, about the addiction that I've been dealing with, and the thoughts and the situation that I had just encountered. And we took action, and I joined what is called Celebrate Recovery. I finally said, I need help. I can't do this alone, and I need to know why I can't break this addiction. So I was introduced to Celebrate Recovery, and even then, I went to the furthest one I could find, so I wouldn't run into anybody. I joined Celebrate Recovery at Crossings Community Church in North OKC, and although I was running, God was waiting for me there. God was waiting for me there, and that's where I began to find healing. I began to expose these thoughts. I began to meet other men that were going through the same thing, had a lot of the same hurt. I ended up sitting next to a guy who we had that you too moment. We started talking about the struggles and how we struggled with it, and a lot of the same issues, a lot of even the same-sex attraction that at one point came into our lives. We were like, whoa, I didn't know anybody else dealt with this. And so we became friends, and we started seeing the freedom that God was bringing in both of our lives. We became really good acquaintances, but the struggle was still there. Pornography was still popping up every once in a while, and I was still like, God, why? I'm going through this. I'm going to keep pushing. It was a year-long commitment. There was a lot of changes in my jobs, and I landed in a job with some of the best people I've ever known. But as a month in, God reminded me that he wanted me to go on a 40-day fast. And I tried it at the beginning of the year, of January of 2023. 3-4 days in, I was sitting in my room with, with the McChicken. I was like, well, can't do this. God reminded me what his word says. Some of these things will not go unless through prayer and fasting. And I said, all right, God, I'm going to do this, but I'm going to do this one day at a time. Because if I look at the 40 days, I'm not going to be able to. It's going to seem overwhelming. I took it one day at a time. One day at a time. And a week in, God speaks to me through a message while at work. And at this work, amazing people, but I was getting stressed out. Now I know that it was God, working in me. God spoke to me and says, I need you to make me your priority. I need you to stop everything. And by everything, I mean everything. So that next day, I went in, told my boss, hey, I got to quit. They tried to convince me to stay. They didn't want to let me go. They were willing to work with me. They were willing to change my job title. They were willing to do everything. But when I shared my heart with them, I thank God for that man that God put in my life. And he's a God-fearing man. And he said, you know what? Yes, you should quit. Do what God is telling you to do. And in those 40 days, I found freedom. Halfway through, I go visit a church that I follow, and in the ministry that I love what God's doing, I go and visit, and the preaching is on repentance. It's in Fort Worth, and I was like, really? I drove all the way here to hear a repentance message. You know, again, the churchianity, all that was rising up, and I said, you know what? Let me listen. And the message got more and more intense, to the point that the pastor's wife that was preaching said she had a dream of someone that was finally going to be set free from pornography. And she goes and describes this dream of basically this demon claiming a man in the dream as their own. Because he says, you partnered with that spirit so long, now it thinks it owns you. But she says, but today is the day that you receive freedom. And in that moment, nothing wild, nothing crazy, just in that moment, I felt a weight lifted off my shoulders. I was in the middle of fast. I was like, you know what? I'm in Dallas. I'm in Fort Worth. I'm going to go to In-N-Out. I'm going to break my fast a little early today. Go enjoy. I was feeling the freedom. On my way back, I was like, you know what? I think I'm good. I don't need to finish this fast. And God reminded me in that moment, this is why you're where you're at. Finish what you started and what I asked you to do. I said, you're right, Lord. At the end of the fast, a week later, I go to this camp called True North at Base Camp. I have another video that talks about my experience there. You can go watch it. But God does a transformative work in me. Encounters me like never before. Shows me that it's time to move on. Takes and says it's time to go. Plucks me out of my home church. Lands me where I'm at now at New Song Church in Edmond. And although I didn't understand then, I am grateful to be where I'm at now. I'm grateful to be in a church that promotes healing, that promotes the presence of God. And I'm not saying that wasn't happening at my other church, but the fact that I landed there, that's what I mean. Of where I landed, and because I listened to the voice of God, and God has done a transformative work in me. You know, pornography is now a thing of the past. Now I'm not like, don't look at it, don't look at it, don't look at it. Now it's I'm not going to look at it. Why should I? You know, those thoughts do come. The temptation does come from time to time, once in a blue moon. But because of the freedom God has given me, because I have made God my priority over these last now 11 months, I can say that I have the tools to combat and to go against what the enemy is throwing against me. But this is the freedom that Jesus has promised me. He has restored me. He has brought friendships in that in the smallest things, God has shown me, you know, I see you. I love you. I want you to be happy. I want you to enjoy life. I want you to smile. I want you to be happy. I want you to serve. I want you to be in ministry, but I want you to love doing it. I want you to love me first and not love the ministry. God has restored my heart. God has really shown me the love of the Father. That no matter how far I ran, no matter how much I hid, God was always there. What the enemy meant for evil, those years of rejection, those years of feeling lonely, those years of not feeling good enough, those years of watching pornography, those years of having lustful thoughts, those years of confusion that would come into my mind. All those years, all those moments, God's like, watch this. I'm going to turn this around. I'm going to use that story. I'm going to use that to glorify my name. And God has shown me that He is a good Father. God showed up in my life in this last year and a half. He showed up to that 6-year-old kid that was wounded by rejection, that was in the corner crying. God has shown up for that kid and has been restoring him into the man that I'm becoming.